The sun in the Arizona Territory, in the year of our Lord 1887, was a merciless thing. It beat down on the land until the earth cracked open in 1,000 tiny fissures, like an old man's skin. The rivers were little more than skeletons of rock and sand, their water a distant memory. Up above, the sky was a vast, searing blue, empty of clouds and empty of pity. The red rock mesas shimmered in the heat, and the wind that swept across the plains was not a cooling breeze but a hot breath that carried the dust and the scent of sage, cutting like a blade. It wasn't just the land that was hard. The air between men was harder still, charged with a tension as thick as summer thunderheads that never broke. The iron horse had carved its way through the mountains, bringing with it a flood of white faces with hungry eyes, men who saw the land not as a mother but as a thing to be broken, tamed, and bled for its riches. For the Apache, the ND, the people, this was the twilight of their age. They were being hunted, herded, and confined to scraps of land the white man deemed worthless. Every shadow could hold an enemy, every distant rider a threat. It was a land of silence and sudden violence. Luke knew that silence well. He lived in it, cultivated it like a small, precious crop. He wasn't old in years, barely 25 summers had passed over him, but his eyes held the kind of weary quiet that only comes from seeing too much, too soon. He had a small, sturdy cabin built with his own hands, tucked deep in a canyon where the ponderosa pines grew thick and the law didn't bother to ride. He kept away from the booming mining towns and dusty settlements, for his past trailed behind him like the shadow of a hangman's noose. A few years back, in a town he'd rather forget, he'd been accused of a killing he didn't commit. He had escaped before they could string him up, but the name they'd branded him with was a ghost that followed him everywhere. So he lived alone, with a few sheep, his horse, and the ghosts. He was tracking a stray ewe, one that had wandered off from his small flock. When he heard the voices, they drifted on the hot wind, coarse and ugly, slicing through the natural peace of the canyon. It was the sound of men who enjoyed cruelty. Luke tethered his horse to a juniper tree, pulling his Colt Peacemaker from its holster, its weight a familiar comfort in his palm. He moved low and silent, his worn leather boots making no sound on the rock and pine needles. He crested a small ridge and saw them, a battered cage-like prison wagon, its wheels mired in the sand of a dry wash. 3 white men, bounty hunters by the look of their greasy dusters and greedy eyes, were dragging 2 figures from the wagon's dark interior. They were Apache girls. The older one fought like a cornered wildcat, her black hair a tangled curtain around a face of fierce, defiant beauty. Her hands were bound tight with rope, but she kicked and twisted, her eyes like black flint spitting fire. The younger girl was limp as a rag doll, her head lolling to one side, unconscious. A trickle of blood snaked from her hairline down her temple. "Hold still, you witch!" one of the men snarled, backhanding the older girl across the face. The crack of the blow echoed in the still air. "She's got spirit, this one." Another laughed, a grimy man with a tobacco-stained beard. "We'll break it out of her before we turn him in for the bounty." Luke's blood ran cold. He knew what breaking her meant. It was a fate worse than any quick death. He saw the way their eyes crawled over the girls, not as people, but as property, as things to be used and discarded. His past had taught him to mind his own business, to turn and walk away. But his soul, what was left of it, wouldn't let him. He stepped out from behind the rocks, his pistol held steady. "That's far enough," he said, his voice level and calm, yet it carried an authority that made all 3 men freeze. They turned, surprised. Their hands hovered near their own guns. "Well now, what have we here?" the bearded one sneered. "Lost your way, cowboy. This ain't your affair." "I'm making it my affair," Luke replied, his eyes not leaving the man's. "Let the girls go." The men exchanged a look, then burst into ugly laughter. Listen to him. One man thinks he can take on three. You got a death wish, friend?" Luke didn't answer with words. He shifted his aim slightly and fired. The bullet screamed past the bearded man's head and punched a hole clean through the water canteen hanging from his saddle, sending a precious stream of water hissing into the hot sand. The laughter died instantly. "The next one won't miss," Luke said, his voice like chipped stone. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Then, the first man, the one who had struck the girl, made his mistake. He thought Luke was focused on the leader. He yanked his pistol, a blur of motion, but Luke had been watching them all. His own gun bucked in his hand, the crack of the Colt sharp and final. The man grunted, a look of utter surprise on his face, before he crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. The other two stared, their bravado vanishing like a desert mirage. They looked at their dead companion, then at the cold, unwavering certainty in Luke's eyes. Without a word, they scrambled for their horses, spurred them mercilessly, and disappeared down the canyon in a cloud of panicked dust. Silence descended once more, heavy and thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Luke kept his gun raised for a long moment before slowly lowering it. His gaze fell upon the Apache girl. She had pushed herself to her feet, her eyes wide, not with gratitude, but with a new kind of fear. She stared at him, then at the dead man, then back at him. As he took a step toward her, she snatched a skinning knife from the dead man's belt. "Stay back," she hissed, the word a guttural rasp. She held the knife with a steady hand, positioning herself between Luke and her unconscious sister on the ground. Luke stopped. He raised his empty hands, showing he meant no further harm. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice low and gentle. He gestured with his chin toward the younger girl. "Your sister, she's hurt bad. She needs help." The girl's fierce gaze flickered to her sister. The fire in her eyes warred with a wave of desperate concern. She saw the blood, the unnatural stillness. She looked back at Luke, this strange white man who had just killed for them. He was an enemy, like all the others, yet he hadn't fled. He was still here, offering help. To trust him was a risk. Not to trust him might be a death sentence for her sister. The choice was agonizing, but it was no choice at all. After a long, tense moment, she gave a short, sharp nod. Her knuckles white around the handle of the knife she still refused to release. He moved slowly, cutting the ropes from her raw wrists. Then he knelt by the younger girl, his touch surprisingly gentle as he checked her pulse and examined the wound on her head. "She's breathing," he murmured, more to himself than to the sister. "But she's got a fever coming on. We need to get her somewhere safe." He carefully lifted the small, frail body into his arms. "My cabin isn't far. You can follow." He named her Ayasha in his mind, though he did not know her name, and the younger, silent one, Kaya. He led the way, carrying Kaya, feeling Ayasha's burning, suspicious eyes on his back every step of the way. She followed a few paces behind, the knife still clutched in her hand, a silent predator trailing a potential threat. His cabin was a small, solid structure of hewn logs, nestled so deep in the pines that it was nearly invisible until you were upon it. It was a place of solitude, a fortress against the world he'd left behind. Inside, it was sparse but clean. A single cot, a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and shelves holding a few books and basic provisions. He gently laid Kaya on his cot, pulling a worn wool blanket over her. As dusk bled purple and orange across the sky, the true battle began. Kaya's fever spiked. Her body, which had been limp, was now racked with violent shivers. Her breathing grew shallow and ragged, each breath a painful rasp in the quiet cabin. Ayasha knelt beside her, wiping her brow with a damp rag, her face a mask of stoic fear. She never took her eyes off Luke. Every move he made, she watched. When he stoked the fire, her hand tightened on her knife. when he fetched water from the spring. She stood in the doorway, blocking any chance of escape or trickery. She was a guardian wolf, exhausted and wounded, but ferociously protective of her pack. Luke understood her distrust. He didn't try to soothe her with empty words. Instead, he acted. He took a lantern and a small pouch and slipped out into the deepening night. Ayesha's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought he was abandoning them, but he returned within the hour, his pouch filled with roots and leaves he'd gathered by moonlight. He knew the land's secrets, its medicines. He brought yarrow to break the fever, willow bark to ease the pain. He worked tirelessly through the night, never speaking. He boiled water in his small pot, crushing the herbs with the hilt of his knife, the fragrant, bitter scent filling the small space. He coaxed the hot, dark tea between Kaya's pale lips. He made a cool poultice and gently laid it on her forehead. He did not rest. He did not complain. He simply worked, his movements patient and methodical, his entire being focused on the fragile life flickering on the cot. Ayesha watched. She watched as the hours crawled by, marked only by the shifting shadows cast by the fire. She watched this strange, quiet man who fought for her sister's life with a silent, dogged persistence. He was nothing like the loud, brutal men from the wagon. There was a deep sadness in him, but also a profound well of decency. She saw the exhaustion etched on his face in the firelight, yet he never faltered. Sometime before the dawn, as the sky outside softened from black to gray, Kaya's shivers began to subside. Her breathing, while still weak, deepened and became more regular. A fragile peace settled over the small body. Luke finally sat back on a stool, his shoulders slumping with fatigue, and watched the sleeping girl. Ayesha looked from her sister's peaceful face to the man who had made it so. The iron wall of her suspicion had not crumbled, but for the first time, a crack appeared. The hard, flinty glare in her eyes began to soften, like desert rock after a long, slow, and desperately needed rain. The days that followed were stretched thin and taut, like a hide drying in the sun. The immediate danger of the bounty hunters had passed, but their shadows lingered. Luke knew men like that. They ran in packs, held grudges, and valued their pride as much as any bounty. The death of one of their own wouldn't be forgotten. He took to scouting the ridges around his canyon each morning and evening, his rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the vast, empty landscape for any sign of dust that didn't belong to the wind. The silence of the cabin was no longer one of peace, but of waiting. It was a shared prison of their own making, a necessary hiding place where three people breathed the same tense air. Ayesha recovered her strength quickly, the fire in her eyes, which had been banked to a wary ember, slowly began to glow again. She was not a woman built for idleness. Without a word being exchanged, a silent partnership formed between them. When Luke brought back a rabbit, she would take it from him, her movements swift and sure as she skinned and cleaned it, wasting nothing. She began to venture from the cabin, never far, gathering firewood with an efficiency that amazed him, stacking it neatly by the hearth. A quiet rhythm established itself, punctuated by the scrape of her knife against a skinning board, the crackle of the fire, and the soft, almost inaudible breathing of Kaya from the cot. She still spoke very little, her English limited to single words. Water, fire, done. But her actions spoke volumes, and sometimes, in the unguarded moments, her body told a story she kept locked behind her lips. One afternoon, as she reached up to a high shelf for the salt tin, the sleeve of her buckskin tunic slipped down. Luke saw them then, on the soft skin of her upper arm and spilling onto her shoulder, a cluster of thin, silvery white lines, the faded tracks of old burns and cuts. They were not the accidental scars of a hard life in the wild, but the deliberate, cruel marks of a torturer's hand. He saw a similar, angrier red scar near her collarbone one evening as she leaned over the fire. His jaw tightened, and a cold, hard knot of fury formed in his gut for the men who had captured them. He said nothing, and she pulled her sleeve down quickly, a fleeting shadow of shame crossing her face before being replaced by her usual stoic mask. Kaya, meanwhile, was a ghost in their midst, her body healed, the wound on her head closing, the fever long gone. She would sit for hours on the edge of the cot or by the cabin's single small window, her hands folded in her lap, watching the world with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of 100 years. She never made a sound. At first, Luke thought it was a deep-seated fear of him, a silence born of trauma. He would try to speak to her gently, offering her a piece of cooked meat or a cup of broth. She would accept it with a graceful dip of her head, her eyes meeting his for a moment, but her lips never formed a word. It was Ayasha who finally gave him the truth, not in a story, but in a few broken, guttural words that cost her more than a day's worth of speech. He had asked, gesturing toward Kaya. "She does not speak." Ayasha was mending a tear in his shirt, her fingers nimble with a bone needle. She paused, her gaze distant. "No words," she said, her voice low. She touched her own throat, then shook her head. She looked at him, her eyes dark with a pain so deep he felt it in his own chest. "Men with guns. Like them." Her hand trembled slightly. "Our mother. She fought. They—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. The horror was plain on her face. Kaya saw. No words. Since that day. The revelation struck Luke like a physical blow. The little girl wasn't just quiet. She was locked away in a prison of silence. The key lost in a moment of unimaginable horror. He looked over at Kaya, who was watching a lizard scuttle across the sun-drenched window ledge, and his heart ached for her. For both of them. A week after the incident, a fierce summer storm rolled through the canyon. Thunder rattled the very logs of the cabin, and rain came down in solid, driving sheets. A leak that Luke had long ignored finally gave way, and a steady drip, drip, drip began near the fireplace. The next afternoon, when the sun had returned with a vengeance and the world was steaming, he climbed onto the roof to fix it. He was surprised when, a few minutes later, Ayasha appeared up the ladder behind him, her face set with determination. He hadn't asked for help, but he accepted it with a nod. They worked together under the hot sun. He pried up the warped shingles, and she handed him fresh ones made of split pine. There was an ease between them up there, a simple focus on the task at hand that stripped away the tension that had filled the cabin. Their hands brushed as she passed him a shingle. He was acutely aware of her closeness, the scent of pine and sage that clung to her. For the first time, he heard her laugh, a low, throaty sound. When he nearly slid off the angled roof, it was a sound as beautiful and unexpected as a wildflower blooming from cracked rock. They finished as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in strokes of fiery orange and deep violet. They sat for a moment on the edge of the roof, their legs dangling over the side, looking out at the canyon. A comfortable silence settled between them. During their work, a glob of sticky pine sap had smeared across the shoulder of Ayasha's tunic. With an impatient sigh, she reached up, unlaced the side of her garment, and shrugged it off her shoulder to better inspect the mess. Her back partially turned to him, and Luke's breath caught in his throat. The setting sun bathed her in golden light, illuminating the smooth, copper curve of her shoulder and the elegant line of her neck. He saw the faint, silvery trace of another scar there, a mark of survival that, in the warm light, seemed less a blemish and more a part of her untamable beauty. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, completely unintentional on her part, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. The respect and protective feelings he had for her suddenly ignited into something else, something raw and powerful and intensely male. He was consumed by a desire so sudden and overwhelming it left him dizzy. He didn't think, he acted. He shifted closer, his hand coming up to gently cup her jaw. Turning her face toward his, he saw surprise in her dark eyes, followed by a flicker of something else. Not fear, but a mirroring spark of curiosity, of longing. The world narrowed to the few inches between them. He could feel her warm breath on his lips. He leaned in, intending to close the distance, to taste the lips that so rarely spoke. But just as he was about to, she flinched. Her eyes widened. The spark extinguished and replaced by a wall of caution. She pulled back sharply, her hand coming up to rest flat against his chest. A gentle but firm barrier. "No," she whispered, the word a mere breath of sound, but it was as final as a slammed door. The moment shattered. The air, once charged with unspoken desire, was now thick with a heavy, awkward tension. She quickly pulled her tunic back into place, hiding her shoulder from his view, and scrambled back down the ladder without another look at him. Luke remained on the roof for a long time, watching the last of the light fade from the sky, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was left with a storm of emotions, a fierce, frustrated wanting, confusion at her retreat, and a deep, unsettling shame for having pushed her. That night, sleep offered him no escape. He dreamed of her, not a violent or crude dream, but one of warmth and silent understanding. They were sitting by the fire, the way they did every night, but in the dream, he reached for her hand, and she did not pull away. She twined her fingers with his, and he drew her close, her head resting on his shoulder, the two of them watching the flames dance in a perfect, unspoken communion. He woke with a start in the dead of night, the dream fading like smoke, his body aching with a loneliness he hadn't realized was so profound. The only sound was the gentle patter of a fresh rain on the roof they had just mended. And from the corner of the room, in the deep shadows beyond the fire's dying glow, a pair of small, dark eyes watched him. Kaya, who missed nothing, had seen the way he and her sister had looked at each other on the roof. She saw the new, electric tension that now filled their small cabin. And in her silent, knowing gaze, there was a sadness that seemed to understand everything. The fragile peace of the cabin was shattered by the sound of barking. Not a coyote, but the sharp, aggressive yapping of a hound on a scent. Luke was instantly on his feet, grabbing his rifle from its pegs on the wall. He motioned for Ayasha to stay down, his eyes hard as he peered through a crack in the log wall. Out on the edge of the clearing, 6 men on horseback were reining in, their faces hard and sunburnt beneath the wide brims of their hats. They were not lawmen. They were the other kind, the kind who made their own law with rope and lead. The surviving bounty hunters had returned, and they had brought friends. "Luke Collins," a voice boomed, rough as gravel. "We know you're in there with them Apache witches. You got something that belongs to us, and we got a rope for the man who killed our friend." There was no time for a plan, only for instinct. Luke turned to Ayasha, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "The back window. Take your sister, run straight for the deep woods and don't look back. I'll hold them off." But Ayasha shook her head, her eyes blazing. She grabbed a small pack and began stuffing it with dried meat and a water skin. "We go together," she said, her meaning clear. She would not leave another person behind. He saw the unshakable resolve in her face, and knew arguing was a waste of precious seconds. Gunshots splintered the cabin door. Luke returned fire through the window, the blast of the rifle deafening in the small space, giving them cover. Ayasha was already hoisting a groggy Kaya onto her back. The girl was small for her age, but it was still a heavy burden. Luke fired again, then kicked open the back shutter. He scrambled out, then turned to help Ayasha and her precious cargo through the narrow opening. They plunged into the thick embrace of the forest just as the first of the men rounded the cabin. They ran. They fled not on a trail, but through the untamed wilderness, a place that was an enemy to the men pursuing them, but an ally to Ayasha. The landscape that had been Luke's refuge now became their shield. He was a capable woodsman, but he was humbled as he watched her. She moved through the dense undergrowth, not like an intruder, but like a whisper of the wind itself. Where he saw an impassable wall of rock, She found a hidden handhold, a narrow deer trail. She led them through tangled thickets and down into dry, winding arroyos that hid their tracks from the horsemen above. Her knowledge of the land was a living, breathing thing. For days they traveled, pushing deeper into the merciless heart of the desert mountains, when their water ran low. She stopped before a large barrel cactus, while Luke might have hacked at it clumsily. She used her small knife with surgical precision, cutting a small, neat bowl into the top and showing him how to scoop out the pulp, which was wet and life-giving. When hunger gnawed at them, she waded into a shallow, muddy creek that Luke had overlooked, her body poised and still as a heron. Her hands darted into the water, and she emerged moments later with 2 wriggling fish, their silver scales flashing in the sun. She caught them with her bare hands. Luke, who relied on his gun and his steel traps, could only watch in awe. He was a survivor, but she was a part of this land. He was a visitor. She was home. One evening, they made a cold camp in a hollow scooped out of the base of a towering red rock formation. The pursuit seemed to have fallen behind, but they took no chances with a fire. The vast, star-dusted canopy of the desert sky was their only roof. Kaya was asleep, wrapped in Luke's only blanket, her face peaceful in the pale moonlight. For the first time in days, the crushing tension eased its grip on Luke and Ayasha. He lay on his back, looking up at the heavens. "That one there," he said, pointing. "My father used to call it the hunter, Orion." Ayasha followed his gaze, a small, skeptical smile touching her lips. "He is no hunter?" she said, her voice soft in the immense quiet. "He is the trickster, the one who stole the fire and scattered it across the sky to make the stars. Our elders tell the story." Luke turned his head to look at her. "A trickster? All I see is a belt and a sword." "You see with a white man's eyes," she retorted, a playful glint in her own. "You see lines and weapons. We see stories. That river of light," she gestured toward the Milky Way, "is the path the spirits walk, and that," pointing to the Pleiades, "is not a cluster of stars. It is a group of young girls who danced into the sky to escape a great bear." He chuckled. "7 girls? I was always told they were the 7 sons of Atlas." They fell into a light-hearted debate, him telling the Greek myths his father had read to him from a worn book, her sharing the ancient stories of the Indi. They were from 2 different worlds, their understanding of the very stars above them, a universe apart. Yet, for the first time, they were not a protector and a victim, not a white man and an Apache woman. They were just a man and a woman, sharing a moment of peace. And in the midst of their quiet argument, Ayasha's smile turned into a genuine, unburdened laugh. It was a sound that broke through the wall of hardship around them, and Luke found himself laughing with her. Nearby, Kaya's eyes were open. She was not asleep. She watched them from her cocoon of blankets, a silent observer to this fragile, beautiful moment. She saw the way Luke's face softened when he looked at her sister, the way Ayasha's shoulders relaxed in his presence. She saw the invisible thread that was weaving itself between them, and in her dark, lonely eyes, a deep, aching longing for this feeling, this connection, this thing that looked so much like a family, welled up. The laughter subsided, leaving a warm, comfortable silence in its wake. They had finished the last of the cooked fish, and the air was growing cool. Ayasha stood up. Luke thought she was going to check on her sister, but instead, she reached down and took his hand. Her fingers were calloused but warm, and they closed around his with a surprising strength. She said nothing, but her eyes held a clear invitation. She tugged gently, and he rose to his feet. She led him away from the small camp, deeper into the shadows of the ancient, twisted juniper trees that clung to the rocks. The moonlight filtered through their branches, dappling the ground in silver. When she stopped, she was so close he could feel the heat radiating from her skin. She didn't release his hand. Instead, she raised it and placed it on her waist. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace that took his breath away, She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of desperation or gratitude. It was a kiss of choice, of claiming. It was soft and hesitant at first, then deepened with a hunger that matched his own. All the unspoken tension, the longing, the fear, and the respect of the past weeks poured into that single moment. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her flush against him, his hands tangling in the wild silk of her hair. He felt her tremble in his embrace, and it struck him with overwhelming force that this fierce, strong woman, who could face down armed men and survive in the harshest wilderness, was vulnerable in his arms. Her hands moved from his chest, sliding up to cup the back of his neck, pulling him closer. Their movements became more urgent, a silent language of touch and sensation. He kissed her jaw, her throat, the sensitive skin near her collarbone where he knew a scar was hidden. His hand slid from her waist, tracing the curve of her back, feeling the lean, strong muscles beneath the soft buckskin. She was fire and earth, a storm and a shelter, and he was completely lost in her. He could feel the ragged beat of her heart against his, a frantic rhythm that echoed the pounding in his own blood. They were on the precipice of something irreversible, a point of no return under the silent watch of the desert stars. Ayasha. A small, sleepy voice drifted from the campsite. It was a faint, breathy sound. Kaya calling out in a dream. The sound, as faint as it was like a bucket of ice water. Ayasha stiffened in his arms. She pulled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her eyes wide and clouded with a storm of emotions. The fire between them was not extinguished, but it was banked, forced back by the quiet call of duty. She rested her forehead against his chest for a moment. Then, without a word, she turned and walked back to the camp. Luke stood alone in the shadows, his body still thrumming with a desire that was now a painful ache. His emotions were a tangled, chaotic mess. He was a protector, a role he understood, but he was also a man, filled with a raw, desperate wanting for the woman who had just walked away. And woven through it all was his profound sense of responsibility for the silent, wounded girl who had just unknowingly called her sister back from the brink. Later, when he returned to the camp, he saw Ayasha lying beside Kaya, her arm thrown protectively over her sleeping sister, across the dying embers of their imaginary fire. Her eyes met his in the darkness. Her expression was unreadable, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that nothing would ever be simple between them again. After 2 more days of grueling travel, following ridges that overlooked the plains, Ayasha stopped. She pointed toward a thin plume of smoke rising from a deep, hidden valley miles ahead. It was a signal so faint that Luke would never have noticed it. "Home," she said, the single word filled with a universe of exhaustion and relief. Their approach to the village was not a triumphant return. As they descended into the valley, 2 Apache lookouts seemed to rise from the earth itself, appearing silently on ponies, their faces grim, their rifles held ready. Their eyes, hard and suspicious, fell on Luke. They spoke to Ayasha in their own tongue, a rapid flow of guttural sounds. She answered, her voice tired but firm, gesturing back the way they had come, then to a healing Kaya, and finally to Luke. The warriors' expressions did not soften. One of them dismounted and, with a curt gesture, took Luke's rifle and pistol. Luke offered no resistance. He understood. He was the wolf walking into the sheepfold, and it didn't matter if he came in peace. He was still a wolf. The village was larger than he had expected. A collection of domed wickiups, shelters made of brush and hides, tucked into the protective curve of the valley wall. It was a place of life, of children playing in the dust and women tanning hides, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat. But as they were led through the center of the village, a hush fell. Every eye turned to them, to the 2 returned daughters and the white man who walked among them like a prisoner. The stares were not curious. They were hostile, blades of silent accusation. They were brought to a halt before a larger wickiup, from which a man emerged. He was old, but he stood straight and tall, his long, graying hair held back by a simple leather band. His face was a roadmap of deep lines carved by sun and sorrow, but it was his eyes that held Luke captive. They were dark, piercing, and filled with a profound, weary sadness. The eyes of a man who had buried too many of his people and lost too many battles. This was their father. This was the chief. Ayesha ran to him, burying her face in his chest, and for the first time, Luke saw her tough exterior crumble completely, revealing the frightened daughter beneath. The chief held her, his hand stroking her hair, his sad eyes looking over her head at Kaya, who stood silently, her gaze fixed on the ground. Then, his eyes moved to Luke, and they hardened into granite. He spoke, his voice a low rumble, and another, younger brave translated, "Why is this white man here?" Before the Luke could speak, he was seized. His arms were pulled roughly behind his back and bound tightly with rawhide. He was forced to his knees in the dust before the chief. The villagers formed a circle, their faces a wall of condemnation. The interrogation began, not with questions, but with accusations. "White men do not help the ND," the translator said, spitting the words. "They take our land, they kill our women, they sell our children. You are a killer. We can smell the blood on you." Luke met the chief's gaze. "It's true. I killed a man," he said, his voice steady, "to stop him and his friends from harming your daughters." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. The chief took a step closer, his shadow falling over Luke. "The white man's tongue is forked," the translator relayed. "He speaks lies to save his own skin. He wanted the women for himself. Or perhaps he wanted the bounty the government pays for our scalps." Luke's heart sank. He had no proof, nothing but his word, and his word was worthless here. He was trapped, judged by the color of his skin and the crimes of his race. He looked at Ayesha, who was watching with a look of anguish on her face. It was then that she stepped forward, into the space between Luke and her father. She stood tall, her voice ringing out through the silent village. First in her own language, then in the English she had learned was necessary for survival. "You are wrong," she cried, her eyes flashing. "All of you, you see a white man, and you see an enemy. I saw one, too, but my eyes were not open." She turned, her arm sweeping out to point at Luke. "This man found us when we were in the hands of monsters. They had beaten Kaya until she could not stand. They had tied my hands." She held up her wrists, showing the raw, chafed skin. "They would have done worse, much worse. This man faced 3 of them, alone. He did not have to. He could have ridden away. No one would have known. But he stayed." She took a breath, her voice thick with emotion. "He killed one of them to save us. He brought us to his home. My sister was dying of a fever. Her spirit was preparing to walk the star path. He sat with her through the night. He went into the dark to find medicine from the earth and brewed it with his own hands. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He fought for her life when I had lost all hope." Her gaze swept the circle of stony faces. "When the others came back for revenge, he stood ready to fight them all to give us time to run. In the desert, when we had no water, he shared his. When we had no food, he gave us what he had. He has asked for nothing. He has taken nothing. He has protected us with his life." She fell silent, her chest heaving. The chief's expression remained unreadable, his sad eyes fixed on his daughter. The silence was broken by a small movement. Kaya stepped forward. She walked to her father and, with trembling fingers, she pulled down the collar of her tunic, revealing the ugly, still-healing gash on her temple where the bounty hunter had struck her. She pointed to the wound. Then she turned and pointed, her small, thin finger aimed directly at Luke. She could not speak, but her meaning was as clear as a thunderclap in the silent valley. "He did this to me. He saved me from this." The chief looked from the wound on his youngest daughter's head to the bound white man kneeling in the dirt. He closed his eyes, his face a mask of deep, agonizing contemplation. The entire village seemed to hold its breath. The moment stretched into an eternity. Luke could hear the blood pounding in his ears. Finally, the chief opened his eyes. He looked at Luke, and for the first time, the hardness was gone, replaced by that deep, ancient sadness. He spoke a single, quiet sentence in the Apache tongue. The translator stared at him in disbelief, then slowly turned to Luke. "Our chief, he says," he stammered, "that in all his years, he has never known a white man to risk his own life for an Apache without seeking payment or reward. He says that the blood you shed was shed for his blood." The chief spoke again, his voice louder this time, filled with an authority that silenced the murmurs that had begun to ripple through the crowd. He took a step forward and, with his own knife, he sliced through the rawhide binding Luke's wrists. "He says," the translator continued, his voice now filled with awe, "that an act of such honor cannot be repaid with horses or blankets. He says, this man deserves to be a part of us. He is welcome in our village." A wave of shock went through the crowd. To accept an outsider, a white man, was unheard of. But the chief was not finished. He looked at his eldest daughter, Ayasha, whose face was a mixture of shock and overwhelming relief. "He says," the translator's voice dropped to a near whisper, "that this man has saved the future of his line. He has proven he is a man of a strong heart." The chief's gaze moved from Ayasha to Kaya, and then to Luke. He spoke one final time, his words clear and deliberate, ringing with the finality of a death sentence or a royal decree. "If her heart chooses," the translator breathed, his eyes wide, "then he has earned the right to take both my daughters as his brides." The world tilted on its axis. The air was sucked from Luke's lungs. He stared, uncomprehending. Ayasha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with utter, stunned disbelief. Beside her, Kaya looked at Luke, and in her gaze, there was not shock, but a flash of something intensely vulnerable, a fragile, gentle light that was immediately tinged with a deep, heart-wrenching pain. The chief had spoken. The pronouncement hung in the air. Impossible and absolute. The villagers stared, their hostility momentarily forgotten, replaced by sheer astonishment. Luke felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, waiting for an answer. But he had no answer. He had no words. The customs of his world, his own morality, his very understanding of life, were crashing against a decree he could not begin to comprehend. Slowly, shakily, he got to his feet, without looking at Ayasha or Kaya or the chief. He turned and walked away from the council circle. He walked past the wiki-ups, past the staring faces, his footsteps unsteady in the dust. He didn't stop until he was out of the village, out on the edge of the vast, open desert. The wind picked up, whipping sand against his face, a raw physical force that matched the storm raging inside him. He stood there, a solitary figure against the immensity of the landscape, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly and utterly lost. He was torn. His heart, his soul, belonged to Ayasha. He knew that with a certainty that was the only solid ground beneath his feet. But as he stood there, the image of Kaya's face, her silent pain, her gentle, wounded eyes, rose in his mind, and with a sickening, bitter wave of truth, he was forced to admit to himself that what he felt for her was not just pity or responsibility. It was a deep, protective tenderness that had, in the crucible of their shared ordeal, been forged into something more. It was a different kind of wanting, a quiet and desperate yearning to see her safe and to erase the sadness from her eyes. He desired them both, and the knowledge was a poison, a truth that threatened to tear him apart. The chief's declaration fell like a great stone into a still pool, and the ripples of its impact spread through the following days, creating a cold, silent distance between the three people at its center. The tentative warmth that had grown between them in the desert vanished, replaced by a guarded formality that was colder than any winter wind. They were no longer three survivors bound by a shared ordeal, but three strangers trapped in a web of unspoken expectation and impossible choices. Ayasha retreated behind the wall of stoicism she had worn when Luke first met her. The laughter he had heard by starlight was gone, her smiles buried. She became a whirlwind of activity, her hands never idle. She worked hides with a fierce, focused energy, scraped cooking pots until they shone, and spoke only when necessary. Her words clipped and impersonal. When Luke approached, she would find a reason to be elsewhere, her eyes sliding past him as if he were a ghost. The easy companionship they had found on the roof of his cabin, the fire they had ignited under the desert stars, was now a memory that seemed to belong to another lifetime. She had closed a door on him, and he did not have the key to open it. Kaya, in her silent world, created her own form of distance. She, who had begun to watch him with a timid curiosity, now avoided his gaze entirely. If he entered the wickiup their father had given them to share, she would find a reason to slip out, her movements as quiet and fleeting as a fawn's. She would spend her days with the other children of the village, watching them play, a solitary figure on the edge of their games. Luke felt her absence like a physical ache. The small, fragile connection he had felt with her, a bond of protection and care, was now stretched to the breaking point. Lost and adrift, Luke threw himself into work. It was the only thing that made sense, the only thing that could quiet the raging storm in his own mind. He was given a place on the edge of the village, and with borrowed tools, he began to build a small, sturdy lan, a three-sided shelter of logs and mud. The physical labor was a blessing. He chopped wood until his shoulders screamed, hauled rocks until his hands were raw and bleeding. It was a penance, though for what sin? He wasn't entirely sure. He hunted for the village, bringing back deer and rabbit, laying his offerings at the chief's wickiup without a word, a silent tribute to the people who had taken him in. A young brave named Nacho, who spoke some English and whose initial hostility had faded into a grudging respect, began to teach him their words. Luke learned to say Dzil for mountain, Tu for water, and Shash for bear. He poured all his energy into these small tasks, hoping that if he built enough, hunted enough, learned enough, he could somehow rebuild the simple peace he had destroyed. Several weeks passed in this strained silence. One night, a cold wind swept down from the high peaks, carrying the first hint of autumn. The change in weather settled badly on Kaya. She woke with a deep, rattling cough, and by midday, she was shivering violently, her skin hot to the touch. The fever had returned. Ayasha tended to her with a desperate, fearful efficiency, but the herbal remedies that had worked before now seemed to have no effect. As night fell, Kaya's breathing grew shallow. The village medicine man came and went, chanting and shaking a rattle, but the girl only seemed to slip further away. Ayasha was beside herself with worry, her face pale and drawn in the firelight. Luke, who had kept his distance all day, could not stand it any longer. He entered their wickiup late that night. Ayasha looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. She didn't protest when he knelt by the girl's side. He felt Kaya's forehead. It was burning. He took a damp cloth and began to gently bathe her face and wrists, his movements slow and steady, just as he had done in his cabin. He took over the task of coaxing sips of willow bark tea between her lips. Ayasha watched him, her defenses momentarily lowered by shared fear for her sister. For a few hours, they were a team again, united in a single purpose. Sometime after midnight, Ayasha, utterly spent, fell into a deep sleep by the fire. Luke remained awake, watching over Kaya. The girl's shivers had eased, and her breathing was a little deeper. He thought she was asleep when he felt a small, cool hand touch his. He looked down. Kaya's eyes were open, lucid and clear, watching him in the flickering light. She slowly brought his hand to her cheek, a gesture of such simple, profound trust it made his heart ache. Then, with a slow, deliberate effort that seemed to take all of her strength, she pushed herself up slightly. She reached out with her other hand, her small fingers gently touching his lips, as if to quiet a protest he hadn't made, and then she leaned forward and kissed him. It was a clumsy, innocent kiss, a soft, tentative press of her dry lips against his. It held none of the fire or passion of Ayesha's kiss, but it was devastating in its own way. It was a kiss of pure, undiluted feeling, of gratitude, of a girl's first fragile affection, of a silent soul screaming to be heard and loved. Luke was frozen for a moment, stunned. His first instinct was to pull back, to correct a line that should never have been crossed. He did lean back, breaking the contact, but he couldn't bring himself to reject her completely. He saw the shimmering tears that had gathered in her eyes, the raw vulnerability on her face. To push her away then would have been an act of unimaginable cruelty. Her face crumpled. A tear spilled over and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. A choked, silent sob shook her small frame. She didn't make a sound, but he could feel the waves of her despair. She clutched the front of his shirt, her small fists twisting the rough fabric, as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was threatening to sweep her away. He hesitated, then wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a gentle, comforting embrace. He held her as she cried her silent tears, his mind a maelstrom of confusion, pity, and a tenderness so fierce it terrified him. This was not about desire. This was about a desperate, human need for comfort after a lifetime of being trapped in silence and fear. The next morning, the fever had broken. Kaya was weak, but she was calm, her eyes clear. Ayesha was overjoyed, her relief so palpable it seemed to light up the small wickiup. She thanked Luke, her voice thick with emotion, and for a moment, he thought the ice between them might finally thaw. But then it happened. He was handing Kaya a cup of water. She took it, and her fingers brushed against his. Their eyes met. It was only for a second, but in that shared glance, the memory of the night before, the kiss, the silent tears, the embrace passed between them. It was a moment of quiet, shared intimacy, a secret acknowledged. And Ayesha, standing by the fire, saw it. She saw the look in his eyes, the faint blush on her sister's cheeks. She saw the invisible thread that now connected them. Her face, which had been soft with relief, hardened into a mask of stone. She didn't say a word. She set down the bowl she was holding, turned, and walked out of the wickiup. Luke knew. He set down the cup and followed her. She was already striding out of the village, heading for the high trails that led into the mountains. A storm was gathering over the peaks, the sky turning a bruised purple-gray. He had to run to catch up with her. "Ayesha, wait!" he called out. She stopped but didn't turn around. "Go back to her," she said, her voice flat and dead. "It's not what you think," he started, but the words felt hollow and false even to him. She spun around to face him, and the storm that was gathering in the sky was reflected in her eyes. "Isn't it?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a rage he had never seen before. "I see how you look at her, how she looks at you. You pity her. You want to save the broken bird." "I care for her," he said, his own frustration rising. "She's your sister. How can I not?" "I have cared for her," she screamed, taking a step toward him, her hands clenched into fists. "I have been her voice, her shield, her strength since the day she lost her own. I have stood between her and the world, and I have taken the blows that were meant for her." The first drops of rain began to fall, cold and hard. A gust of wind tore through the canyon, whipping her hair across her face. "Do you have any idea what that is like?" she cried, her voice breaking, the sound half carried away by the wind. "To always be the strong one, to never be allowed to be weak, or selfish, or afraid. I have always felt like a shadow. Luke, a shadow that exists only to protect her light." Her words struck him harder than any physical blow. He saw it all then, the crushing weight of the burden she had carried her entire life. It wasn't jealousy he saw in her eyes, but a lifetime of sacrifice, of being the protector, the one who could never break. Tears were streaming down her face now, mixing with the rain. He closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as a clap of thunder echoed through the mountains. She fought him for a moment, her fists beating against his chest. But then her strength gave out, and she collapsed against him, her sobs shaking her entire body. He held her close, burying his face in her wet hair, his own tears blurring his vision. "I know," he whispered. His voice choked with an emotion so powerful, it felt like it would tear him apart. He held her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "I know, but you have it all wrong." He looked into her stormy, tear-filled eyes. I see her pain, and I want to help her, but you—" He had to stop, his throat tight. "You are the only light I have seen in all my dark years." The storm in the mountains was a prelude to the storm that broke upon the village. Their argument, raw and honest, had washed the air clean between them. For the first time, Ayasha had allowed herself to be vulnerable, and Luke had met her not with pity, but with a confession of his own that left her breathless. They returned to the village in the pre-dawn gloom, soaked and exhausted, but with a fragile new understanding linking them. It was a peace that was destined to be short-lived. Revenge, in the West, was a patient predator. It traveled on tired horses, fueled by cheap whiskey and wounded pride. The men Luke had driven off from his cabin had not forgotten. They had nursed their grudge, gathered reinforcements, and followed the faint trail of rumors to the hidden Apache stronghold. They came not in the honest light of day, but under the cloak of a moonless night. The attack began not with a war cry, but with the silent slice of a knife that silenced a lone sentry. Then, the night exploded. Gunfire ripped through the quiet, turning the peaceful village into a hell of flashing muzzles, screaming women, and panicked shouts. The raiders rode through the camp, firing indiscriminately into the wickiups, their dark forms silhouetted against the fires they started. It was not a battle. It was a massacre, a brutal act of retribution aimed at the innocent. Luke, Ayasha, and her father were instantly awake, the chaos erupting around them. Warriors, grabbing bows and old rifles, tried to form a defense, but they were outnumbered and taken by surprise. Luke grabbed his own rifle, his mind racing. "Get Kaya! Get to the caves behind the village!" he yelled to Ayasha over the din. But it was too late. As Ayasha ducked into their wickiup, two of the raiders burst through the hide flap. One of them, a hulking man with a greasy beard, grabbed Kaya, who was frozen in terror. He clamped a hand over her mouth and began dragging her out. Ayasha flew at him like a hawk, knife in hand. But the second man slammed the butt of his rifle into her side, sending her sprawling to the ground, gasping for air. "We got one of the chief's daughters," the man bellowed triumphantly. "Let's go!" They dragged the struggling, silent girl out into the chaos and back toward their horses. Luke saw it happen from across the clearing. A cold, white-hot rage, purer and more terrible than any he had ever known, consumed him. All thought, all strategy, vanished. There was only one thing in the world that mattered: Kaya. "They have Kaya!" he roared to the chief and the other warriors. "They're heading for the rocks to the north." He didn't wait for them. He sprinted through the burning, chaotic village, a desperate, single-minded force. He saw the group of raiders breaking away from the main attack, forcing Kaya onto a horse. They were retreating, using her as their shield, their trophy. Luke followed, the Apache braves close behind him, a small, desperate band against a larger, better-armed foe. The raiders didn't flee into the open desert. They spurred their horses up a narrow, rocky canyon, heading for a place where they could make a stand. Luke and the warriors, on foot, were faster and more agile on the treacherous terrain. They closed the distance, arrows and bullets whining through the dark. They reached the end of the canyon, a box-like enclosure with a dark cave mouth gaping in the rock face. The raiders had dismounted, taking cover among the boulders, dragging Kaya with them into the cave's entrance. They had their hostage. They had the high ground. "Give us the white man! Collins!" the leader shouted from the darkness. "Give him to us, and the girl lives. We'll settle for him." Luke ignored him. He knew they were liars and killers. He turned to the chief's warriors. "Give me cover," he said, his voice grim. "When I go, fire at everything you see." Before they could argue, he broke from cover. He ran, not zigzagging, not thinking of his own safety, but in a straight, suicidal line directly for the mouth of the cave. He was a man possessed, driven by a singular, desperate need. The world erupted in gunfire. The Apache warriors laid down a volley of fire, their arrows thudding into the rocks around the cave, their few rifle shots echoing off the canyon walls. The raiders returned fire, the muzzle flashes lighting up the dark. Luke ran through the storm of lead, the air alive with the buzz of angry hornets. He felt a searing pain tear through his left shoulder, spinning him around, but he didn't fall. He scrambled forward, diving behind a rock just feet from the cave. He could hear Kaya's terrified, muffled whimpers from inside. He pulled his pistol, took a deep breath, and launched himself into the darkness of the cave. He was met by the big, bearded man who had first grabbed her. The man swung his rifle like a club. Luke ducked under it, driving his shoulder into the man's gut. They crashed to the ground, a tangle of limbs in the dark. Luke brought his pistol up and fired, the blast deafening in the enclosed space. The man went limp. Another figure loomed over him. Luke rolled, firing again. A cry of pain. He scrambled to his feet, his vision swimming. He saw Kaya, her eyes wide with terror, her hands bound. A third man held a knife to her throat. "Drop it, Collins, or she dies," the man snarled. Luke didn't hesitate. He let the pistol fall from his numb fingers. As the man's eyes flickered down to the gun, Luke lunged forward. Not at the man, but at Kaya, shoving her sideways, out of the way. It was a desperate, foolish move that left him wide open. A deafening boom filled the cave, and a fire exploded in his back. The force of the shot threw him forward onto the hard rock floor. He lay there, the world fading to a gray buzz, his last conscious thought of the Apache warriors storming the cave behind him. The next thing he knew, he was being carried. The fighting was over. He was slung over the shoulder of one of the braves. He lifted his head weakly and saw Ayasha. She was running beside them, her face a mask of horror. He saw her eyes fix on something, and he followed her gaze. Kaya was being carried just ahead of him, safe, but her back was covered in a slick, dark liquid. It was his blood. The sight broke Ayasha. A terrible, ragged sob was torn from her throat. She stumbled, her hands flying to her mouth as she saw the lifeblood of the man she loved staining the back of the sister she lived to protect. All her strength, her fire, her resilience, shattered in that one awful moment, and she wept. The days that followed were a blur of pain and fevered dreams. Luke was laid in the chief's wickiup, the medicine man working over him, packing the terrible wounds in his back and shoulder with herbs. The bullet had gone clean through, but he had lost a great deal of blood. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale and clammy. The entire village believed he was walking the spirit path, his life flickering like a dying candle. But he was not alone. Ayasha and Kaya were a constant, silent presence by his side. They bathed his feverish skin, forced broth and water between his lips, and kept a ceaseless vigil. In the long, quiet hours of the night, as they sat together listening to his ragged breathing, a change occurred. One night, Kaya, her eyes filled with tears, reached out and took her sister's hand. Ayasha gripped it tightly, her own tears falling silently. For the first time, they were not protector and protected, not rivals for an affection they didn't understand. They were just two sisters, holding on to each other, united in their shared, desperate fear of losing the same man. They held hands for him. He survived. On the fourth day, his fever broke. He drifted back to consciousness slowly, like a man swimming up from a deep, dark lake. The first thing he saw was their faces, one on each side of him, etched with worry and sleeplessness. He felt a hand in each of his. Ayasha was holding his right, Kaya his left. He tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. He squeezed their hands weakly, their heads snapped up, their eyes wide. He managed a few words, his voice a hoarse, broken whisper. He looked from Ayasha's fierce, tear-streaked face to Kaya's gentle, wounded one. The truth, the one he had wrestled with in the desert, was the only thing he had left. I cannot choose. The words hung in the air, a confession of his divided heart. He had failed them both, loved them both, and he could not untangle the knot in his soul. He expected anger, or sadness, or confusion. Instead, he saw a look pass between the two sisters, a silent communication that was as old as their bond. Ayasha looked down at their joined hands, his, hers, and Kaya's, and a small, sad, but resolute smile touched her lips. She looked back at him, her eyes clear and filled with a strength that humbled him. Then we will choose you, she whispered, her voice soft but unwavering. Together. Ayasha's whispered declaration was not the end of the matter, but the beginning of a new and difficult path. The chief, her father, accepted his daughter's choice with his customary grave solemnity. He had made his pronouncement, and his daughters had answered. In his eyes, the matter was settled by honor and blood, but the rest of the village was not so easily convinced. The decision sent a tremor of disquiet through the community. To join a man with two sisters was a custom of the ancient past, rarely practiced and spoken of only in the stories of the elders. To do so with a white man, an outsider, a member of the race that was actively destroying their world, felt to many like a violation, a sacrilege. Whispers followed Luke as he slowly regained his strength. Warriors who had fought beside him now looked at him with renewed suspicion. The women of the village fell silent when Ayasha and Kaya passed. This union was a stone cast into the placid waters of their traditions, and the people feared the unforeseen ripples. The opposition grew until a council of elders formally approached the chief. They sat with him in the cool shade of a great cottonwood tree, their faces etched with concern. "This is not our way anymore," one of them said, his voice heavy with respect but firm in its conviction. "The world has changed. To bind our chief's daughters to this outsider is to invite a bad spirit into our homes. He is not ND." The chief listened patiently, his sad eyes moving from face to face. When they had all spoken, he was silent for a long time, watching a hawk circle high in the searing blue sky. Finally, he looked at them, and his voice, though quiet, held the unbending authority of a mountain. "You say he is not ND," he began, "and you speak the truth, but his spirit is, when my daughters were in the hands of our enemies, where were the ND warriors to save them? When my youngest was dying, where were the ND medicine men who could bring her back? It was this man, this outsider, who stood when others would have run. It was his blood that was shed for mine. The law of the white man is full of words on paper that they use to steal and to kill. Their justice is a lie." He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "What we do here is not for them. It is for us. We repay a debt of blood with a bond of blood. This is not about their laws. This is about our justice." His words silenced the dissent. It was not a happy acceptance, but it was an acceptance nonetheless. The chief had spoken, and he had invoked a principle deeper than custom: honor. The wedding was held a week later, on the night of the full moon. It was a strange and solemn affair, stripped of the usual joyful celebrations. It felt less like a marriage and more like the forging of a treaty. The entire village gathered in the central clearing, the silver moonlight washing over them. making the landscape of red rock and dark pines seem otherworldly. A great fire burned in the center, its flames leaping toward the star-filled sky. Luke stood before the chief, dressed not in his cowboy clothes, but in a simple, unadorned buckskin tunic and leggings that had been made for him. He felt like an actor in a play he didn't understand. His wounds still ached, a constant reminder of the violence that had brought him to this moment. Ayasha and Kaya came to stand beside him. They were dressed in beautiful white doeskin dresses, intricately decorated with beads and porcupine quills. They looked like desert royalty, remote and beautiful. Ayasha's face was a mask of fierce resolve, but Luke could see the faint tremor in her hands. Kaya stood with her eyes downcast, a figure of such fragile grace that it made his heart clench. There were no spoken vows, as Luke would have known them. The ceremony was a thing of symbols and actions. The medicine man chanted, his voice a low, rhythmic drone that seemed to vibrate with the pulse of the earth itself. Drummers began a slow, steady beat, and a line of warriors began a dance, their feet stomping the dust in a ritual as old as the mountains around them. The chief then brought forward a wreath. It was a thing of harsh and startling beauty, woven not from flowers, but from the thorny stems of a cactus, the sharp spine still intact. Woven among the thorns were the black and white tail feathers of a golden eagle. The thorns represented the pain and hardship of the world they lived in, the reality of their struggle. The eagle feathers symbolized courage, wisdom, and a connection to the Great Spirit. The chief lifted the wreath and placed it carefully on Luke's head. The thorns pricked his scalp, a sharp, immediate sting. It was not a crown of victory, but a crown of shared suffering and shared honor. Then the chief took a single, long strip of soft leather. He took Luke's right hand and Ayasha's left and bound them together. He then took Kaya's right hand and bound it to Luke's left. They were linked, a chain of 3, standing before the fire, bound by the chief's authority and the traditions of his people. He spoke to them in his own language, his voice soft now, not for the crowd, but for them alone. Ayasha translated later that he had blessed them not with a wish for happiness, but with a prayer for strength. When the ceremony was over, they were led to a small, new wickiup that had been built for them at the edge of the village. It was to be their home. The villagers watched them go in silence, their faces illuminated by the firelight, their thoughts their own. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of fresh pine boughs and sage that had been laid upon the floor. A small fire burned in a central pit, casting a warm, flickering glow on the hide walls. A single, wide sleeping platform had been built, covered with thick, soft buffalo robes. There was a profound, heavy silence in the small space, broken only by the crackle of the flames. The 3 of them stood, still bound by the leather thongs, uncertain of what to do, how to begin this new, impossible life. It was Ayasha who moved first. As she had always done, she took charge, with gentle, deliberate fingers. She untied the knots that bound Kaya to Luke, and then the ones that bound herself to him. She moved without a trace of awkwardness, her actions simple and practical. She looked at Luke, her dark eyes searching his. Then she looked at her sister, who was trembling almost imperceptibly. Ayasha's expression softened. She went to Kaya and put her arms around her, holding her for a long moment, whispering something soft and reassuring in her ear. Then she turned back to Luke. She walked to him and, without a word, began to unlace the front of his tunic. Her fingers were steady, but he could feel the slightest vibration in them. He stood perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs. When the tunic was open, her fingers traced the line of the angry, healing scar on his shoulder. It was a touch not of passion, but of acknowledgement, of remembrance. She then took his hand and led him to the sleeping platform. She motioned for him to sit. She turned to Kaya, holding out her other hand, hesitantly. Kaya came and sat on his other side. They sat there for a long time, The three of them, staring into the fire, the silence stretching, becoming not awkward, but meditative. Again, it was Ayasha who broke the stillness. She lay back on the robes, pulling a heavy blanket over herself. She looked at Luke, her eyes an open and clear invitation. He lay down beside her, his body stiff and uncertain. She then looked past him to Kaya, her gaze soft and encouraging. Slowly, like a fawn taking its first steps, Kaya lay down on Luke's other side. The three of them lay under a single blanket, not touching, separated by a chasm of unspoken questions. Ayasha reached across him, her hand finding Kaya's in the dim light. She gave it a reassuring squeeze. Then, she turned her attention to Luke. She moved closer, the warmth of her body a startling comfort in the cool air. Her hand came to rest on his chest, right over his heart. He could feel her fingers tracing small, slow circles. It was a calming, steadying touch. His own hand came up and covered hers, his fingers lacing with hers. He felt a small, hesitant touch on his other side. It was Kaya. Her fingers, light as a moth's wing, touched his arm. He turned his head and could just make out her form in the firelight, her eyes wide and luminous. He offered her his hand, and she took it, her grip surprisingly firm. And so they lay, connected, a bridge of hands in the quiet dark. Ayasha, ever the anchor, began to guide them. She leaned in and kissed him, a slow, deep kiss that was not about the frenzied passion of the desert, but about sealing a vow. It was a kiss of profound intimacy, a confirmation. When she pulled away, she shifted, her movements encouraging Luke to turn his attention to her sister. He looked at Kaya, who watched him with an expression of terrified hope. He leaned over and gently, reverently, kissed her forehead. He felt her tremble violently. He then kissed her cheek, and finally, her lips. It was a chaste, tender kiss, meant only to reassure. But it broke something open inside her. As his lips touched hers, a sound escaped from her throat. It was not a word. It was a small, broken whimper, a sound of pain and release, and 100 other emotions for which there were no names. It was the first sound he had ever heard her make. It was the sound of a lock, rusted shut by years of trauma, finally giving way. Another small, choked sound followed, a sigh that was almost a sob. She wasn't speaking, but her soul was, after a lifetime of silence. Her heart was finally making itself heard in the quiet of the wickiup, a testament to the strange and painful miracle that had brought the three of them together. The years that followed did not soften the land, but they settled into the valley like fine dust, creating a life where one had seemed impossible. Luke, the hunted man, became a guardian. The people of the village, who had first seen him as an enemy, came to see him as a part of the landscape itself, as steady and quiet as the red rock mesas that sheltered them. He never fully became one of them, nor did he try. He remained a man caught between two worlds, and in that space, he found his purpose. He became a protector of the valley, a keeper of the borderlands, watching the trails for intruders and acting as a bridge of cautious understanding with the few trappers or prospectors who wandered too far from their own kind. Life in their wickiup found its own rhythm, a quiet dance of three souls bound into one. A year after their union, Ayasha gave birth to a son, a strong, healthy boy with his mother's fierce black eyes and Luke's quiet way of watching the world. They named him Taza, a name that meant strength in her people's tongue. He became the center of their small universe. Luke would carry him on his shoulders while checking his snares, teaching him the names of the birds and the tracks of the deer. Ayasha would tell him the old stories by the fire, her voice a low, mesmerizing current that spoke of coyote tricksters and warrior spirits. And Kaya, though she never spoke a word, found her own voice. She was the keeper of the child's joy. While Ayasha taught him lore, Kaya taught him life. She would hum ancient, wordless melodies, her voice a soft, breathy sound that was more beautiful than any spoken word. She taught Taza the intricate steps of the ceremonial dances, her hands and body telling the stories her lips could not. She would take him to the creek bed and show him how to make patterns with colored stones. She communicated in touch, in shared glances, in a language of the heart that the boy understood perfectly. Luke would often watch her with the children of the village, a silent, graceful figure leading them in a game or a song. And he saw not a broken woman, but a well of deep, serene strength. The past, however, has a long memory. It arrived one hot afternoon in the form of 3 riders. They were not bounty hunters. They were composed. Their gear was clean, and the man in the lead wore a tarnished silver star pinned to his vest. He was a U.S. Marshal, and his eyes were tired but unyielding. They rode into the village, and a tense silence fell. The marshal dismounted, his gaze sweeping over the scene until it landed on Luke, who was mending a fence near his home. "Luke Collins," the marshal called out, his voice leaving no room for argument. Luke slowly put down his tools and walked to meet him, Ayasha appearing at his side, her face a hard, protective mask. "I'm Collins," Luke said. The marshal unfolded a piece of paper. "I have a warrant for your arrest, issued by the territory of Arizona, for the murder of one Jebediah Finch, 6 years ago." The name was a ghost from a life he had almost forgotten. The world seemed to shrink around Luke. Warriors began to emerge from their wiki-ups, their hands moving toward their weapons. Ayasha's hand tightened on his arm, her knuckles white. "That was a long time ago," Luke said, his voice level. "And it wasn't murder." "The law will decide that," the marshal said, his eyes flicking to the gathering warriors. "I don't want trouble here. I've come to take one man. You come peacefully, and we ride out peacefully. You resist, and I will come back with 100 men, and we will burn this place to the ground to get you." It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. Luke looked at Ayasha's defiant face, at the warriors willing to die for him, at the children, including his own son, peeking out from behind the hides. He had run once before. He would not run now. He would not let them pay the price for his past. "I'll go," he said, the words tasting like ash. Ayasha cried out, a sound of protest, but he put a finger to her lips. "It's the only way," he whispered. "To protect this, to protect all of you." As the marshal produced a pair of iron handcuffs, the old chief stepped forward. He walked past the lawmen as if they were invisible and stood before Luke. He held a small, deerskin pouch, beaded with sacred symbols. "My son," the chief said, his voice clear and strong for all to hear. "The white man's law comes for your body, but they cannot have your spirit." He pressed the pouch into Luke's hand. "This holds the soil of this valley, where your son was born. It holds a feather from the eagle that watches over us. You carry our home with you." He placed a hand on Luke's shoulder, his sad eyes looking directly into the marshal's. "He is not just a white man living among us. He is a man of this land now. His blood has watered this ground. Our justice has already claimed him. See that your justice is not blind." Luke was taken away, leaving a silence in the village that felt heavier and more desolate than any before. The trial was a blur of a stuffy courtroom and hostile faces, but Luke was not alone. Ayasha was there. She stood before the judge, proud and unbroken, and told the story in her clear, simple English. She told them of her capture, of the cruelty of the men, of how Luke had saved them. Her testimony was powerful, a story of survival that shamed the smug assumptions of the courtroom. And then, a miracle. The marshal, a man of surprising decency, had done his own digging. He had found a record from a neighboring territory of a cattle rustler who, before he was hanged, had confessed to a string of crimes, including being part of the group that had ambushed Jebediah Finch, the very incident for which Luke had been blamed. The man's dying declaration confirmed Luke's innocence. He was acquitted. He was a free man. He walked out of the courthouse and stood for a moment, letting the unfamiliar feeling wash over him. Then he turned his face toward the mountains and began the long journey home. He traveled for days, his heart pulling him forward. On the final day, the sky, which had been a brassy, cloudless bowl for months, turned a deep, bruised gray. The first rains of the season began to fall, a gentle, hissing shower that washed the dust from the air and turned the world clean and new. He crested the final ridge overlooking the valley just as the sun was setting. The rain had softened to a fine mist, and the smell of wet sage and damp earth rose up to greet him like a welcome. He saw his home, the small shelter he had built, with a thin curl of smoke rising from the smoke hole. And there, standing under the small overhang of the roof, looking out at the rain, were two figures. They stood side by side, watching the trail, as if they had been waiting there all along. He walked down into the valley, his footsteps making no sound on the damp earth. They saw him, and they did not run to him. They simply waited. As he drew close, he saw the unshed tears in Ayesha's eyes and the radiant, silent joy on Kaya's face. He reached them and pulled them both into his arms, burying his face between their two heads, breathing in the familiar scent of wood smoke and rain. He held them for a long time, the three of them a single, solid shape against the twilight. When he finally pulled back, Ayesha laid her head on his shoulder, her body relaxing against his in a gesture of complete trust and relief. His other arm was still around Kaya. He looked down at her, and his eyes widened. She was fuller, her body changed. Without thinking, he laid his hand gently on her stomach, and he felt it, a faint but unmistakable flutter of movement from within. A new life. He looked from Kaya's shining, tear-filled eyes to Ayesha's soft smile. In that moment, standing in the clean, rain-washed air, he knew he was finally, truly home. The past was a ghost. The future was an unwritten story. But here, now, with one woman leaning against his shoulder and another carrying their child beneath his hand, the sacred fire of their unlikely love burned bright and eternal against the wild, red heart of the land. Thank you for listening to our story here around the campfire. Let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. We'd love to hear from you. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales from the Old West. And feel free to share your thoughts on Luke and his Apache brides.